Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some San Jose Sharks roster moves as they have sent down multiple players to try and fit into the NHL's maximum roster cap as well as under the salary cap. Now, technically, the Sharks did start their season a few days ago, Friday, Saturday, with the back-to-back games against the Nashville Predators, but that was a stadium series set of games that were overseas with sort of special exceptions because of the fact that if players were to get injured in Europe, it would be much more difficult to actually sort of replace them because you're very, very far from home. And so the Sharks were able to bring many more players, kind of exceed the salary cap and roster cap in that particular situation. But now that they have finished over there and are returning back home, the San Jose Sharks do have to follow the rules that every other team does, and as such, they've waived Arundel, they waived Jeff Viel. Both of those players did clear waivers, so they will head to the Barracuda. They sent down Nick Cicek, and most importantly and most disappointingly, they also sent down William Eklund and Thomas Bordeleau, which will be the topic of this video. This was a move that happened a couple of days ago, and I've really sort of been trying to formulate what exactly my thoughts are on this situation, as I'm sure many people know from having watched my previous videos that I'm not super happy that neither of these two players got to play in the first couple of games of the Sharks season, and I'm even more upset that they're not going to be playing, at least for the foreseeable future. I imagine at some point they will get called up, but we do not know if that will take a couple of weeks or even a couple of months. Having said that, the reaction to this news was somewhat mixed between the San Jose Sharks fans. Some people were actually extremely disappointed, like myself, that these two players would never actually get to play. Some people were kind of apathetic to the move. They were thinking, well, the Sharks are going to lose anyways, and even if they were to play those young players, they'd still lose, so who really cares? Let's tank hard for Bedard. That was some reaction, but there were also some people who were actually somewhat happy about the move, giving the usual types of excuses that we hear, the usual types of statements that we hear when young players get sent down from the major leagues to the minor leagues. And I'm going to actually discuss some of those usual comments. The first one is, well, it's better for them to win games in the American Hockey League than for them to lose games in the National Hockey League because it will ruin their confidence. Now, of course, I cannot actually speak for Eklund or Bordeleau in this situation. In fact, I cannot speak even as a young player in the NHL because I am none of those things. But I can say at the very least, in my own opinion, that I would much rather be playing in the NHL compared to in the AHL, even if I am on a losing team. I mean, these players have worked their entire lives with the ultimate goal of being able to make it to the NHL. And this is not a sort of backhanded comment onto what the AHL is. It does its job exceptionally well of being a developmental league for the minor leagues right below the NHL. But having said that, the NHL is the main stage. It's what is the ultimate goal for every young player who is aspiring to be a hockey player. It is just really where you want to be as soon as possible. I mean, just the fame and the stardom that can come with this type of situation is completely and utterly unrivaled in the hockey world. I mean, you take a look at if a player were to score a hat trick in the AHL, certainly fans of that team and that organization would be excited and hyped up to see that player doing very, very well, but that would be just about it. But if that player were to score a hat trick in the NHL, not only would fans of that team and that organization be insanely excited, but that player would also make the 24-hour hockey news cycle. His face would be plastered around all of the highlight videos that are playing on ESPN and TSN and Sportsnet and all of these types of things because of that ultimate performance. Remember when Timo Meier scored those 5 goals yesterday? That was the talk of the hockey world for a decent amount of time, and that is really what so many of these hockey players really dream of. And so I can imagine that you'd think a player would much rather be in the NHL, even in a losing situation, compared to the AHL because of just the amount of more hype and fandom and stardom that surrounds the National Hockey League. Again, I can't really speak for them. Maybe I'm completely off base with this opinion, but that's how I see it. The other comment that people make, and this is one that I sadly have to agree with, which is that, oh, it is better for these two players to get top line minutes in the AHL compared to getting like 10 to 12 minutes in the bottom six in the NHL. And the reason I say I sadly agree with this is because this is probably what would happen if Eklund or Bordeleau were to be given ice time at the NHL level. They'd randomly be placed on the third line. They wouldn't be played in situations where a game is particularly close, and then at the end of the game you'd see on the score sheet that they played about 11 minutes and 17 seconds or something along those lines. But the reason I find this sort of statement and this reasoning for why it's a good thing to be sent down to be kind of bad is that this isn't some sort of etched in stone rule for the NHL that a young player needs to be played in the bottom six. It's not as though if you check in the rule book of the NHL in section 14 paragraph C that it says a young player needs to be playing less than 12 minutes a game in the bottom six. This is not the case. The fact is that these players could be inserted higher up in the lineup. It's just that we know, unfortunately, that David Quinn or most NHL coaches, in fact, would not actually do that, right? It's very, very possible that if the Sharks wanted to play a player like William Eklund in the lineup, instead of putting him in the bottom six, they could just have him on the first line with Meier and Hertl, and nobody is going to come after them. No league official is going to say, hey, you can't do that. You can't put your, rookie phenom type of player on your first line. No. They have to play with Evgeny Svechnikov and Yona Gadjevich on the fourth line, or else we're not going to allow it. Nobody's actually going to say that. So this is it very easily can just be done. And honestly, it's not even a situation, because obviously the response to that would be, well, it's unfair to take a young player who hasn't necessarily proven anything and immediately insert them into a position over the players who do deserve those spots. And sure, if the Sharks were a competitive team, I might agree with that. Let's say take a look at the San Jose Sharks from the 18-19 season when they had that stacked top six. They had Meier, Couture, Hertl, Kane, Pavelski, Nyquist. Even the Sharks' third line had some real strong names like Kevin Lebank at the time and Joe Thornton at the time. And so in a situation like that, if Eklund and Bordeleau were on that team, sure, I'd say, yeah, if you put them in the lineup, you'd have to put them into the bottom six, and at that point, it wouldn't really be worth it, so send them down to the AHL. But with the current roster of the San Jose Sharks, the 22-23 roster for the San Jose Sharks, who would you be replacing in the top six if you were to try and insert a player like William Eklund? Well, obviously, it's not going to be Meier, Couture, Hertl, but you would replace someone like Luke Kunin, who, to be fair, has had a pretty solid start to the season with the San Jose Sharks, but that is a small sample size of just 2 games, and it's not as though his previous performances with the Nashville Predators really merit him being on a first line in the National Hockey League. And even if we were to look past Luke Kunin, if we were to say, you know what, he was good enough in those first couple of games, there is multiple positions on the second line that Eklund could fill into. Kevin Lebank also had a pretty decent start to this season with those first couple of games, but that was preceded by 3 full years of Kevin Lebank being a mediocre at best player and at worst being someone who was essentially a healthy scratch. And then on the other wing on the second line, we have Steven Lorenz, who, to be fair, was also decent in Game 2 of this regular season when he got placed into the second line, but he was still kind of just a throw-in player in the Brent Burns deal with the Carolina Hurricanes, and likely wasn't expected to be anything more than just competitive for a fourth-line spot. So do really any of these players on the San Jose Sharks so much deserve to be in these particular positions that if Eklund were to supplant them, they would be genuinely upset? No, they have nothing to be upset about. And then if we were to actually take a look at the third line, the Sharks could easily run with a slightly more offensive third line. If he replaces Matt Nieto, does Matt Nieto get to be upset for not being on the third line? I mean, this guy got time on the second line for absolutely no reason last season, and he's nothing more than a fourth liner who's pretty decent at the penalty kill. And if we were going to actually talk about players who should get what they deserve, let's actually talk about Nick Bonino, who has somehow managed to lock down a third-line center spot when he was generally the most disappointing player for the San Jose Sharks last season, an absolutely awful season compared to his expectations last year, and his reward coming into this year was still having the third-line center spot, and even on top of that, getting an assistant captain title, which basically locks in the spot and prevents him from really really ever being a healthy scratch for the season. And if we take a look at the first couple of games that he actually played here for the San Jose Sharks this year, hoping for maybe some sort of turnaround, they were still generally awful. And so to talk about it, oh well, Bordeleau and Eklund don't actually deserve their spots. Well, if we were to actually go by who deserves what spot on this Sharks roster, you'd essentially have Meier, Hertl, and Couture in your top 6, and then 9 empty slots because nobody else really actually deserves the spot that they have here. We take a look at the fourth line of Yona Gadjevich and Svechnikov. Ooh, they had a couple of good preseason games, which is literally the most useless part of the entire season. I guess they actually deserve now to be on the fourth line over our actual strong rookie players. I mean, take a look at Thomas Boardlow. He actually played NHL games. So did Eklund, but Boardlow played NHL games at the end of last season. I believe he played about 8 or 9 games last year, and I would wager that he had more offensive impact in that short period of games than Yona Gadjevich had in the significantly more games that he played last year. I believe Gadjevich probably had over 4 times the amount of games that Bordeleau had, and yet Bordeleau had more of an offensive impact. You could probably take Bordelow's best game last year, and in that just one game, he likely had more offensive impact than Gadjevich had the entirety of last season, because that's how ineffective Gadjevich was on that fourth line. And yet, because he had a couple of good preseason games where he was, you could say, even carried a bit by Daniil Gushin on his line, oh well, suddenly now he deserves to be here in the main roster, and Eklund and Bordeleau, they need to be sent down because they didn't prove anything in the preseason. Ooh. And so just generally, this comment about the fact that, oh, it's better that they get the top line minutes in the AHL compared to bottom line minutes in the NHL, this is only technically true, and we should be able to just completely go against this and play them in the Sharks' top 6, or at the very least the Sharks' top 9. There's nobody really on this roster who you're thinking, well, it's not fair if they actually go above them in the lineup. Oscar Lindblom, he was not even that great for the Philadelphia Flyers last season, and he hasn't started off particularly well for the San Jose Sharks this year either. Couldn't one of Eklund or Bordeleau replace him in the lineup, or bump him down to the fourth line and kick out Yona Gadjevich or Evgeny Svechnikov and play them? It's just there definitely are spots in the lineup that one of these two players could fit into, and yet they're just not doing so. But those are also just the generally maybe more selfish reasons to actually get them into the lineup. But there are also very franchise style of reasons for why the San Jose Sharks as an organization should want these players in the lineup. And this kind of goes back to the reason why the San Jose Sharks are not really rebuilding, right? They're not taking the same sort of Chicago Blackhawks route where they're completely selling off every player and expecting to be bad for multiple seasons to try and get back. And that is that the San Jose Sharks do not want to sacrifice financially. Already in the past few seasons, things haven't been going that great because of the COVID situation for the San Jose Sharks financially. And if they were to just come out and admit that they're not going to actually try and win any games, it's not going to be super easy to actually sell tickets to fans for a team that is expected to lose. And so the Sharks are coming out and they're saying, no, we're definitely going to be competing for a playoff spot, or at least we're going to be trying to compete for a playoff spot, so that fans can still actually buy in and be somewhat encouraged to spend their money to watch this team. But if we take a look at the roster that the Sharks are icing this year, it is so very similar to the roster that the Sharks iced last year in terms of relative strength. And last year, the Sharks missed the playoffs by an extremely wide margin. So what makes us think that this year the same thing would actually, we would get a different result this year? That it was essentially just be betting on the fact that certain players who had certain seasons last year could somehow just outperform that substantially. And if, Meier and Hertl and Couture had down years last season, maybe that could be the case, but all three of those players actually outperformed what you may have expected from their expectations. So to expect them to take yet another step forward and really carry this team to the playoffs is kind of out there. And so how could you otherwise get people to try and spend money to go see these games, even though that the Sharks are icing a pretty boring roster? Well, you could actually have some of their younger prospects in the lineup that people would want to pay money to see. I talked about earlier the 8 or so games that Thomas Bordeleau had last season. Those were some of the most exciting games for the San Jose Sharks last year. I remember near the end of the season when it was very clear that the Sharks were not going to make the playoffs, it was kind of difficult to get through watching some of those games near the end of the season. But once Bordeleau was actually inserted into the lineup, suddenly this gave a very very interesting player to watch. And I would wager that besides maybe the 5-goal game from Timo Meier, the most exciting part of last season, the most memorable moment from the 21-22 season was when Thomas Bordeleau scored that shootout winning goal against the Vegas Golden Knights. That not only was, an incredible goal, very, very nice, but it also was the goal that really hurt and kind of essentially knocked the Vegas Golden Knights out of making a playoff spot that year. That would have been a pretty exciting moment no matter who would have scored that goal. If it was Tomas Hertl, sure, we would have all been very excited that very night. But the fact that it was Thomas Bordeleau makes it an extremely memorable moment that we can still talk about, multiple months in the future from where it is then. And so Bordeleau inserting into the lineup suddenly made the team very fun to watch once more. And so this year, the Sharks have already lost the first 2 games of the season. The morale is already kind of down at this point for even the fans who thought that the Sharks could make the playoffs. Seeing them lose the first couple of games probably isn't doing much for that. So why not insert a player like Bordeleau, like Eklund, like Merkley, even maybe like a Tristan Robbins or a Danil Gushin? Why not? You cannot lose games harder than you're already losing the game. The Sharks are 0-2. They can't go 0-2 even harder. They were going to lose those games anyway, so why not, throw a wild card into the ring? Why not try and get a younger player? Because maybe they can actually surprise you. Maybe they can actually do pretty well, and maybe that could actually give a reason to watch the San Jose Sharks this season. Class dismissed.